Picture this. You're at a Renaissance dinner party, and the beautiful blonde woman across from you just smiled while handing you a goblet of wine. Her name is Lucrezia Borgia, and statistically speaking, you're probably about to die. Not from her beauty though, that's lethal enough, but from whatever delightful cocktail of arsenic, mercury, or good old-fashioned nightshade she's mixed into your Chianti. Welcome to the Renaissance, where family dinners were more dangerous than Game of Thrones, and significantly less subtle about the whole murdering your way to power thing. If you enjoy stories where historical figures make modern politicians look like choir boys, you know what to do. Let's dive into the most toxic family in history. Before we talk about Lucrezia, we need to understand the Borgia brand. And yes, I'm calling it a brand because these people understood marketing centuries before Don Draper was even a glimmer in some ad executive's martini-soaked imagination. The Borgias weren't just a family, they were a Renaissance startup that specialized in corruption, nepotism, and creative assassination techniques. Think of them as the Kardashians, but with actual political power and a significantly higher body count. Their patriarch, Rodrigo Borgia, didn't just climb the social ladder, he murdered, bribed, and seduced his way up each rung until he became Pope Alexander VI. Yes, the Pope, the soap's moral authority of Christian Europe. The irony is so thick, you could cut it with a poisoned dagger. Now, imagine growing up in this household, while other Renaissance kids were learning Latin, and maybe how to paint a decent fresco. Borgia children were getting masterclasses in manipulation, political strategy, and the fine art of making enemies disappear. It was like an Ivy League education, but deadlier, and with better wine. Rodrigo had several children, but his favorites were his sons Juan and Cesare, and his daughter, Lucrezia. Juan was the golden boy, handsome, charming, and completely useless at everything that mattered. Cesare was the brilliant psychopath, who would later inspire Machiavelli's The Prince. And Lucrezia? Well, Lucrezia was supposed to be the pretty princess who married well and produced heirs. But here's where the Borgia family's understanding of gender roles gets creative. See, most Renaissance fathers viewed their daughters as political chess pieces, valuable, but ultimately expendable pawns in the great game of European politics. Rodrigo Borgia looked at his daughter and saw something else entirely: a weapon. Not just any weapon, but a Swiss Army knife of political manipulation. Beautiful enough to seduce, intelligent enough to scheme, and loyal enough to the family brand that she'd never betray them. Or would she? The thing about the Borgias is that they understood something most powerful families miss. Reputation is everything, but only if you control the narrative. They didn't just commit crimes, they committed them with such style that people couldn't help but be fascinated. They were the Renaissance equivalent of a true crime podcast. Except the criminals were writing their own episodes. And Lucrezia? She wasn't just born into this world, she was crafted by it. From the moment she could walk, she was being trained for greatness. Not the kind of greatness that gets you sainthood, but the kind that gets you whispered about in taverns 5 centuries later. She learned languages, politics, art, and probably a dozen different ways to kill someone with household items. But here's what's fascinating about the Borgia approach to child rearing. They didn't just teach their children to be cruel, they taught them to be excellent. Cesare became one of the most brilliant military strategists of his age. Lucrezia became a patron of the arts who could hold her own in intellectual discussions with the greatest minds of the Renaissance. They were monsters, yes, but they were incredibly well-educated monsters. Think about it this way. If the Borgias were a modern family, Rodrigo would be running a tech empire while simultaneously being investigated by the FBI. Cesare would be the heir apparent, who's definitely committed at least 3 murders, but is so charming that nobody wants to believe it. And Lucrezia would be the daughter who graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, speaks 6 languages, and has a mysterious habit of outliving her boyfriends. The Renaissance was a time of incredible cultural flowering: art, literature, science, all experiencing a golden age. But it was also a time when political power meant life or death, not just for rulers but for entire cities. The Borgias understood this better than anyone. They didn't just want to survive the Renaissance, they wanted to own it. So when Lucrezia Borgia entered the world on April 18, 1480, she wasn't just being born into a family, she was being drafted into an army that fought with marriage contracts instead of swords, with dinner invitations instead of siege engines, and with poison instead of arrows. And as we'll see, she didn't just serve in that army, she became one of its most effective generals. But here's the question that will haunt this entire story. Was Lucrezia Borgia a victim of her family's ambitions? Or was she an enthusiastic participant in their schemes? Was she the poisonous daughter of legend? Or was she simply a brilliant woman trying to survive in a world that viewed women as property? The answer, like most things about the Borgias, is probably both more complicated and more disturbing than you'd expect. Let's paint a picture of Lucrezia's childhood, shall we? While most 6-year-olds were playing with wooden toys and maybe learning to read, little Lucrezia was attending diplomatic receptions where she watched her father negotiate treaties with the same casual ruthlessness most people reserve for buying groceries. This wasn't a normal hurdle, this was a masterclass in Machiavellian politics, and the curriculum started in diapers. The Borgia household wasn't just wealthy, it was obscenely, almost cartoonishly wealthy. We're talking about the kind of money that makes modern billionaires look like they're shopping at thrift stores. Rodrigo didn't just have influence, he had the kind of power that could make entire armies appear or disappear based on his mood at breakfast. And he made sure his children understood exactly what that power meant. Lucrezia's education was unique. While other noble daughters were learning embroidery and maybe how to manage a household, Lucrezia was studying languages, philosophy, theology, and what we might generously call interpersonal relations, though that's a euphemism for learning how to manipulate people so effectively they'd thank you while you destroyed them. She was fluent in Italian, Spanish, French, and Latin by the time she was 10. Most adults today can barely handle one language without autocorrect. But here's where it gets interesting. Rodrigo didn't just want Lucrezia to be intelligent, he wanted her to be irresistible. Not just physically attractive, though she certainly was that, but mentally captivating. He hired the best tutors in Europe to train her in conversation, wit, and what the Renaissance politely called charm. She learned to play multiple musical instruments, to dance, to paint, and to discuss theology with cardinals, twice her age, without missing a beat. Think of it as finishing school. But if finishing school were run by psychological warfare experts, she learned to read people the way most of us read street signs, quickly, accurately, and with an eye toward getting where we need to go. By age 12, she could identify a person's weaknesses within minutes of meeting them, and craft a conversation that would have them eating out of her hand by dessert. The family dinners alone must have been educational experiences. Picture this. You're 8 years old, sitting at a table with your father the Pope, your brother who's definitely a sociopath, your other brother who's an idiot, but thinks he's Napoleon, and whatever collection of cardinals, ambassadors, and probable assassins happen to be visiting that week. The conversation topics weren't exactly age-appropriate. Pass the salt, and by the way, how's that war in Naples progressing? Are we still planning to poison the French ambassador, or have we moved on to more subtle forms of murder? Lucrezia learned early that in the Borgia household, loyalty was everything, and sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Family members who disappointed Rodrigo had a tendency to die in mysterious accidents. Family members who excelled got cities to rule and unlimited budgets for their artistic projects. The lesson was clear: be useful or be dead. But here's what made Lucrezia special. Even within this family of exceptional criminals, she never seemed to struggle with the moral implications of what they were doing. While modern audiences might expect some kind of internal conflict, some moment where young Lucrezia looked around at the carnage and thought, maybe we're the bad guys, there's no evidence she ever experienced that kind of crisis. She adapted to the family business the way other children adapt to piano lessons. This wasn't necessarily because she was inherently evil. The Renaissance was a different world, with different moral standards. Political murder wasn't just common. It was practically a job requirement for anyone who wanted to stay in power. The Borgias were unusually good at it. But they weren't uniquely immoral by the standards of their time, they were just more successful. And Lucrezia? She was being trained to be the perfect Renaissance woman, beautiful, intelligent, cultured, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. She learned to see people, not as individuals, but as chess pieces in a larger game. That skill would serve her well in the years to come, though whether it served her victims equally well is debatable. The really fascinating part is how normal this all seemed to her. By the time she was 13, Lucrezia could discuss assassination techniques over breakfast, plan a wedding that was really a military alliance, and compose poetry that would make grown men weep, all before lunch. She wasn't becoming a monster, she was becoming a Borgia, and in Renaissance Italy, that was arguably the same thing. Her tutors reported that she was not just intelligent, but genuinely curious about the world. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. not because they were inappropriate, but because they demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that was unsettling in someone so young. If we poison Duke so-and-so, she might ask, what happens to his trade agreements with Venice? And if Venice retaliates, do we have contingency plans for protecting our interests in Naples? These weren't the questions of a normal teenager. These were the questions of someone who was being groomed to run an empire, and the most disturbing part, she was really, really good at it. By the time Lucrezia reached adolescence, she had received what was arguably the finest education available in Europe, combined with practical training in skills that would have made a CIA operative jealous. She was ready for whatever role her father had planned for her. The only question was whether the world was ready for her. If you think modern dating is complicated, let me introduce you to Renaissance marriage politics, where every wedding invitation was essentially a declaration of war, and every divorce required at least 3 armies and a papal decree. For the Borgias, marriage wasn't about love, it was about conquest. And Lucrezia? She was about to become their most effective weapon. At 13. Yes, 13, because the Renaissance had different ideas about appropriate marriage age that would make modern child services have a collective aneurysm. Lucrezia was already engaged. Not to one person, mind you, but in a series of engagements that were made and broken based on shifting political alliances. Think of it as political speed dating. Except the stakes were entire kingdoms and the penalty for a bad match was usually death. Her first engagement was to Cherubino Juan de Centelles, a Spanish nobleman who probably thought he was getting a sweet political alliance and a beautiful bride. What he actually got was a front row seat to Borgia family dynamics, which is roughly equivalent to being trapped in a room with hungry tigers. The engagement was broken when Rodrigo decided that Spanish alliances weren't as useful as he'd initially calculated. Cherubino was probably relieved, though he might not have lived long enough to fully appreciate his good fortune. Then came engagement number 2, Don Gaspar Aversa, Count of Procida. This lasted about as long as a Renaissance haircut, which is to say, not very long at all. Rodrigo realized he needed stronger allies than whatever the Count of Procida could provide. So poor Gaspare got the political equivalent of being left at the altar. Except in this case, being left at the altar probably saved his life. But the third time was the charm, at least temporarily. Enter Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pizarro, and the first man brave enough or stupid enough to actually marry into the Borgia family. The wedding, held in 1493 when Lucrezia was still 13, was like a Renaissance version of a mafia wedding, beautiful, expensive, and absolutely guaranteed to end in violence. Giovanni seemed like a reasonable choice, politically speaking. The Sforza family controlled significant territory in northern Italy, they had money, and they had armies. Plus, Giovanni was young, reasonably attractive, and hadn't been assassinated yet, which in Renaissance Italy was basically a character reference. What could go wrong? Everything. As it turned out, the marriage started pleasantly enough. Lucrezia moved to Pizarro, where she played the role of dutiful wife with the same skill she brought to everything else. She hosted diplomatic receptions, managed the household, and generally behaved like a model Renaissance noblewoman. Giovanni, for his part, seemed genuinely fond of his teenage bride. He probably thought he'd hit the political jackpot, a beautiful wife from the most powerful family in Europe. But here's the thing about marrying the Borgia. You're not just marrying the person, you're marrying the entire family business. And the family business had a tendency to expand in directions that made their in-laws extremely uncomfortable. Giovanni soon discovered that being married to Lucrezia meant being expected to participate in whatever schemes Rodrigo and Cesare were cooking up. And those schemes were getting increasingly ambitious. The problem was that Giovanni wasn't cut out for Borgia-level politics. He was a perfectly competent minor nobleman, but the Borgia has operated on a different level entirely. They were playing chess while he was still figuring out checkers. When they asked him to contribute troops to their latest military adventure, he hesitated. When they suggested he might want to poison a rival, he balked. When they hinted that certain political prisoners might suffer unfortunate accidents while in his custody, he actually looked uncomfortable. This was not Borgia behavior. This was the behavior of someone who still believed in quaint concepts like morality and legal due process. The Borgias found this incredibly disappointing. Meanwhile, Lucrezia was learning some uncomfortable lessons about married life. It turned out that being a wife, even a powerful wife, meant giving up some of the independence she'd enjoyed in her father's household. She couldn't just poison people who annoyed her. she had to consult with Giovanni first. She couldn't unilaterally decide to declare war on neighboring city-states. She had to consider her husband's opinion. It was like being forced to use training wheels on a motorcycle. The marriage lasted about 3 years, which in Borgia terms was practically a golden anniversary. But by 1497, it was clear that Giovanni had outlived his political usefulness. The Sforzas were no longer the allies the Borgias needed, and Giovanni's squeamishness about mass murder was becoming a liability. Time for a divorce. Now, getting a divorce in the Renaissance required papal approval, which sounds like it might be difficult unless your father happens to be the Pope. Rodrigo obligingly declared that the marriage had never been consummated, a claim that was as diplomatically necessary as it was biologically creative, considering that everyone involved knew exactly what had been going on behind closed doors. Giovanni, understandably, objected to having his masculinity publicly questioned by the Pope. He threatened to reveal certain secrets about the Borgia family, which was roughly equivalent to threatening to juggle live grenades while riding a unicycle. The Borgias responded to this threat with characteristic subtlety. They invited Giovanni to Rome for negotiations. Giovanni, demonstrating more intelligence than he'd shown during the entire marriage, declined the invitation and fled to his family's territory. He would live another decade, which, by Borgia standards, made him practically immortal. He spent those years wisely, keeping his mouth shut, and staying as far away from Rome as geographically possible. And Lucrezia? She returned to her father's household, officially a virgin again thanks to papal decree, and considerably more experienced in the arts of marriage, politics, and strategic divorce. She had learned that marriage was indeed a weapon, but like any weapon, it needed to be wielded carefully, and sometimes it needed to be discarded when it was no longer useful. The stage was set for marriage number 2, and this time, the Borgias had bigger plans. Just when you thought Lucrezia's love life couldn't get more complicated, enter Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscay. If Giovanni Sforza was Lucrezia's training wheel's husband, Alfonso was her sports car, beautiful, exciting, and absolutely guaranteed to end in a spectacular crash. But first, let's talk about how this particular political disaster came to be. By 1498, the European political landscape had shifted like a Renaissance game of musical chairs, except the chairs were kingdoms, and the music was the sound of armies marching. The Borgias needed new allies, and the Kingdom of Naples suddenly looked very attractive. Alfonso wasn't just any Neapolitan nobleman. He was the illegitimate son of King Alfonso II of Naples, which in Renaissance terms made him practically royalty. Illegitimate children of kings were often more politically useful than legitimate ones, since they had royal blood but fewer inconvenient claims to thrones. Alfonso was 17, devastatingly handsome, and possessed of the kind of romantic charm that made women write bad poetry. More importantly, from the Borgia perspective, he came with military alliances, trade agreements, and the kind of political connections that could help them expand their influence into southern Italy. He was exactly what they needed, a combination of eye candy and political utility. The wedding, held in July 1498, was everything a Renaissance political marriage should be: magnificent, expensive, and secretly terrifying for everyone involved. Lucrezia, now 18 and considerably more sophisticated than during her first marriage, played her role perfectly. She was the radiant bride, the dutiful daughter, and the living symbol of Borgia power. Alfonso, for his part, seemed genuinely enchanted by his new wife. Poor bastard, he had no idea what he was getting into. Unlike her first marriage, this one started with actual affection. Alfonso wasn't intimidated by the Borgia reputation. If anything, he seemed to find it exciting. He was young enough to mistake danger for adventure, and romantic enough to believe that love could conquer politics. It's the kind of thinking that makes for great poetry and terrible life decisions. For a brief shining moment it almost worked. Lucrezia and Alfonso appeared to be genuinely happy together. They hosted lavish parties, patronized artists, and generally behaved like a Renaissance power couple. Alfonso fit into Roman society like he was born for it, charming cardinals and intimidating rivals with equal skill. Even Cizia seemed to approve of his new brother-in-law, which should have been Alfonso's first warning sign. But here's the problem with marrying into the Borgia family: your happiness is entirely dependent on their political needs, and those needs change faster than Roman weather. What seemed like a brilliant alliance in 1498 started looking like a liability by 14. The political situation in Naples was deteriorating. France was making aggressive moves toward Italian territory, and the Borgias were beginning to recalculate their strategic priorities. Alfonso, unfortunately, was loyal to his birth family in Naples. This loyalty was admirable, romantic, and absolutely fatal. As tensions between France and Naples escalated, Alfonso found himself in an impossible position: support his wife's family and betray his homeland, or support his homeland and become a liability to the most dangerous family in Europe. He chose loyalty to Naples. It was a principled decision, an honorable decision, and a completely stupid decision. The first sign of trouble came when Alfonso started receiving death threats. Not anonymous notes slipped under his door, but formal, almost bureaucratic warnings that his continued existence was becoming inconvenient for certain powerful parties. Alfonso, displaying neither remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity, ignored them. He increased his personal security, sure, but he continued to advocate for Neapolitan interests in Rome. Lucrezia, caught between her husband and her family, tried to play mediator. She loved Alfonso, possibly the only person she ever truly loved, but she was still a Borgia first and a wife second. She warned him, as subtly as she could, that he needed to be more flexible in his political positions. She suggested that perhaps he might consider adjusting his loyalty to Naples in favor of loyalty to Rome. She even hinted that his life might depend on it. Alfonso, romantic fool that he was, interpreted this as a test of his character. He declared that he would never betray his principles for political expediency. It was exactly the kind of noble statement that gets you remembered favorably by historians, and remembered very briefly by your contemporaries. The marriage was now effectively doomed, though Alfonso didn't know it yet. The Borgias had made their decision. Alfonso of Aragon had to go. The only question was how to accomplish this without making Lucrezia hate them forever. They needed to eliminate Alfonso while maintaining the fiction that they had nothing to do with his death. It was a delicate operation that required all their skills in deception and misdirection. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Lucrezia knew what was coming. She had grown up in this household. She understood how it worked. When family members became politically inconvenient, they suffered accidents. When in-laws chose other loyalties over Borgia loyalties, they developed sudden health problems. She could read the writing on the wall, even if Alfonso couldn't. So what did she do with this knowledge? Did she warn Alfonso directly? Did she help him escape? Did she choose love over family for once in her life? The historical record is frustratingly unclear on this point, which probably means that, whatever she did, she was very careful not to leave evidence of it. What we do know is that by the summer of 1500, Alfonso was a marked man. Lucrezia was pregnant with their child, and the Borgia family was preparing to solve their Alfonso problem with characteristic efficiency. The stage was set for one of the most brutal episodes in a family history that was already soaked in blood. And Lucrezia? She was about to learn whether her loyalty to family was stronger than her capacity for love. It was not a lesson she would enjoy. Nothing says Renaissance romance quite like your husband being murdered by your brother, while your father provides the alibi. Welcome to July 1500, when the Borgia family decided that Alfonso of Aragon had officially overstayed his welcome on planet Earth. What followed was a masterclass in political assassination that was somehow both elaborately planned and utterly botched. Peak Borgia efficiency, really. The first attempt happened on July 15th, and it was about as subtle as a Renaissance carnival. Alfonso was walking across St. Peter's Square. Yes, Peter's Square, because apparently the Borgias thought murdering someone in the most sacred location in Christendom would add a nice touch of irony to the proceedings. When he was attacked by a group of masked assassins, they stabbed him multiple times and left him for dead in a pool of blood about 50 yards from the Pope's front door. Here's where it gets almost comically incompetent. Alfonso survived. Not only did he survive, but he managed to crawl to safety and receive medical attention. The would-be assassins, who were probably expecting a quick, clean kill, instead found themselves dealing with a very much alive, very angry Duke, who was now surrounded by guards and demanding justice. This was not how professional assassinations were supposed to go. Alfonso was carried to his apartments in the Vatican, because nothing says safety like recovering from an assassination attempt in the same building as the people who ordered it, where he was tended to by the best physicians in Rome. Lucrezia, now visibly pregnant and presumably dealing with some complicated emotions about her family trying to murder her husband, threw herself into nursing him back to health. She barely left his bedside, personally preparing his food and medicine, and maintaining a guard of loyal servants to protect him. This created an interesting dynamic. Alfonso was recovering from an assassination attempt, while living under the same roof as his would-be killers, being nursed by a wife who almost certainly knew more about the plot than she was letting on. It was like a very dark, very Italian version of a soap opera, except the drama was real and the body count was about to increase. For about a month, this bizarre situation continued. Alfonso grew stronger daily, Lucrezia played the devoted wife, and everyone pretended that masked assassins randomly attacking papal in-laws was just one of those things that happened in Renaissance Rome. Rodrigo visited Alfonso regularly, expressing concern for his recovery and outrage at the attack. Cesare also stopped by to check on his brother-in-law's progress, probably taking notes on what went wrong with the first attempt. But here's the thing about the Borgias. They didn't give up easily. If at first you don't succeed at political murder, try again. And this time, they were going to handle it personally. On August 18th, 1500, Cesare Borgia decided to stop outsourcing the family business. He walked into Alfonso's sick room, where his brother-in-law was finally recovering enough to walk around and probably planning to leave Rome as soon as humanly possible. What happened next depends on which historical account you believe, but they all agree on the basic facts. Cesare strangled Alfonso to death with his bare hands. Some versions of the story claim that Alfonso had been plotting against the Borgias, and that Cesare was acting in self-defense. Others suggest that Alfonso had discovered something incriminating about Borgia business practices, and needed to be silenced. The most likely explanation is the simplest. The Borgias had decided Alfonso was a political liability. The first assassination attempt had failed, and Cesare was tired of waiting for subtlety to work. Imagine being Lucrezia in this moment. You're 19 years old, 7 months pregnant, and you've just watched your brother murder your husband in what was supposed to be a safe room in the Vatican. Your father is the Pope, your brother is a sociopath, and you're carrying the child of a man who was just strangled by your own family. This is the kind of trauma that would send most people into therapy for decades. Lucrezia's response was more complicated. The official story, released by the papal court, was that Alfonso had died from complications related to his earlier injuries. This fooled absolutely no one, but it provided a fig leaf of plausible deniability. Cesare claimed he had acted to protect the family from Alfonso's treacherous plots. Rodrigo expressed deep sorrow at the loss of his beloved son-in-law, and ordered prayers to be said for Alfonso's soul. It was a performance worthy of the Renaissance theatre, except the audience was composed of European diplomats who all knew exactly what had really happened. And Lucrezia? Her public response was perfectly calibrated grief. She mourned appropriately, dressed in black, and withdrew from public life to focus on her pregnancy. Privately, however, her reaction was more complex. Some historians argue that she was genuinely devastated by Alfonso's death, and that this was the moment she began to truly hate her family. Others suggest that she had known what was coming, and had made her peace with it before it happened. The truth, as usual with the Borgias, is probably somewhere in the middle. Lucrezia had loved Alfonso, possibly the only genuine romantic love of her life, but she was still a Borgia. She understood that in their world, love was a luxury that couldn't be allowed to interfere with political necessity. Alfonso had chosen loyalty to Naples over loyalty to the Borgias, and that choice had consequences. What's really fascinating is how quickly life returned to normal after the murder. Within weeks, the Vatican was hosting parties again. Cesare was planning new military campaigns, and everyone was pretending that nothing unusual had happened. Alfonso's death became just another entry in the long list of mysterious fatalities that seemed to follow the Borgias wherever they went. Lucrezia gave birth to Alfonso's son, Rodrigo, in November 1500. The child was a living reminder of her murdered husband, but also a potential political asset. In the Borgia household, even grief had strategic value, and as Lucrezia held her newborn son, she was already being prepared for her next assignment, marriage number 3. Because in the Borgia family business, there was always another deal to be made, another alliance to secure, and another husband to potentially outlive. If you think losing 2 husbands by age 20 would slow someone down, you clearly don't understand the Borgia approach to resilience. Lucrezia's response to being widowed by fratricide was to become the most sophisticated political operator in Renaissance Europe. Think of it as graduate school in Machiavellian politics, with a curriculum that would make modern CIA training programs look like kindergarten finger-painting classes. Between 1500 and 1502, While most 20-year-old widows would be focusing on raising their children and maybe finding a nice quiet life away from murderous relatives, Lucrezia was getting a masterclass in running an actual government. Rodrigo, perhaps feeling slightly guilty about the whole ordering your son-in-law's assassination thing, decided to give his daughter real political power. He appointed her governor of Spoleto and Foligno, making her one of the few women in Renaissance Europe to hold actual administrative authority. This wasn't a ceremonial position or some Renaissance equivalent of a participation trophy. Lucrezia was given real responsibilities, managing taxation, settling legal disputes, overseeing military defenses, and basically running two small but strategically important cities. It was like being handed the keys to a corporation, except the corporation had armies and the quarterly reports were written in blood. And she was brilliant at it? Absolutely terrifyingly brilliant. Lucrezia approached governance with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything else, but with an added element that surprised everyone: genuine compassion for her subject. She reduced taxes, improved infrastructure, and settled long-standing legal disputes with a combination of wisdom and efficiency that made her genuinely popular. People loved her, which was not a common reaction to Borgia family members. This created an interesting paradox. Here was a woman who had been trained from birth to be ruthless, who had witnessed unspeakable violence, and who was related to some of the most feared people in Europe. And yet, when given actual power over people's lives, she chose to be good at it, not just competent, but actually beneficial to the people under her authority. It was like discovering that Darth Vader had a side hobby of running orphanages, but governance was just one part of her education during these years. Lucrezia was also learning to be a Renaissance cultural patron on a grand scale. She surrounded herself with artists, poets, philosophers, and musicians, creating a court that rivaled anything in Florence or Milan. She wasn't just collecting famous people like trophies, she was engaging with them intellectually, commissioning works and participating in the kind of high-level cultural discourse that defined Renaissance humanism. Pietro Bembo, one of the greatest poets of the age, became completely infatuated with her during this period. Their correspondence, which survived, reveals a woman of extraordinary intellectual sophistication who could discuss theology, philosophy, and literature with equal facility. She wasn't just beautiful, she was genuinely brilliant, and she used that brilliance to create a circle of influence that extended far beyond politics into the realm of ideas. This was revolutionary. Most powerful women of the Renaissance exercised influence through their relationships with men, as wives, mothers, or mistresses. Lucrezia was building power based on her own abilities, her own intelligence, and her own political skills. She was creating a new model for what a powerful woman could be, even if she was doing it within the context of a spectacularly dysfunctional family. Meanwhile, her relationship with her family was evolving in fascinating ways. Rodrigo seemed genuinely proud of her administrative success, bragging about her achievements to foreign ambassadors as if she were a prize stallion he'd bred himself. Cesare, surprisingly, treated her as something approaching an equal partner in the family business. He consulted with her on military strategy, asked her opinion on political alliances, and generally behaved as if murdering her husband had been just another business decision that shouldn't affect their working relationship. And Lucrezia? She seemed to accept this with remarkable equanimity, whether this was because she had genuinely forgiven them, because she was playing a longer game, or because she had simply internalized the Borgia approach to compartmentalizing violence, is unclear. What is clear is that she continued to work effectively with the people who had destroyed her marriage and killed the father of her child. During this period, she also became a mother in a more comprehensive sense. In addition to raising Alfonso's son Rodrigo, she was apparently caring for several other children of uncertain parentage, who were connected to the Borgia household. The Renaissance approach to family relationships was flexible, and powerful families often accumulated children through various means: legitimate births, illegitimate affairs, political arrangements, and sometimes just charitable impulses. One of these children was particularly interesting: a boy named Giovanni, whose parentage was mysteriously connected to either Rodrigo or Cesare. The exact details were kept deliberately vague, but Lucrezia raised him as if he were her own son. This suggests either remarkable generosity of spirit or remarkable political calculation with the Borgias. It could easily be both. By 1502, Lucrezia had transformed herself from a political pawn into a political player. She had proven she could govern effectively. She had built a network of cultural and intellectual connections across Europe, and she had demonstrated the kind of loyalty to family that could survive even the most extreme tests. She was ready for her next assignment. And that assignment was going to be her most challenging yet. Marriage to the heir of one of the most powerful duchies in Italy. This wasn't going to be another training exercise or another political alliance that could be dissolved when it became inconvenient. This was going to be the marriage that would define the rest of her life and establish her permanent place in European politics. The question was whether her new husband would survive long enough to find out what kind of wife he was getting. Given the Borgia track record with in-laws, the odds were not encouraging. But then again, maybe the third time would be the charm, or maybe Lucrezia had learned enough about politics to keep this husband alive long enough to be useful. Either way, it was going to be interesting. Picture this. You're Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, and someone suggests you should marry Lucrezia Borgia. Your immediate response should probably be, absolutely not. I've read the obituaries of her previous husbands, but Alfonso d'Este was either braver than most men, or significantly worse at pattern recognition. Because, in 1502, he agreed to marry the most dangerous woman in Renaissance Europe. This decision would either make him incredibly powerful, or incredibly dead. Possibly both. The negotiations for this marriage were like watching a chess match between grandmasters. Except the pieces were armies, and the stakes were the future of Italian politics. Ercole d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and Alfonso's father, didn't particularly want his son to marry into the Borgia family. He was old enough to remember when political alliances were less likely to involve mysterious poisonings and more likely to involve straightforward warfare. But by 1502, the Borgias weren't just powerful, they were essential. Cesare had spent the previous few years conquering most of central Italy with a combination of military brilliance and strategic terrorism that had made him the most feared man on the peninsula. The Papal States were expanding like a Renaissance empire, and anyone who wanted to survive needed to be on the right side of Borgia ambitions. Ercole looked at the political map, performed some calculations that probably involved estimating the life expectancy of Borgia in-laws, and decided that alliance was preferable to conquest. The dowry negotiations alone were spectacular. We're talking about 200,000 ducats in cash, roughly equivalent to the GDP of a small nation, plus various territorial concessions, trade agreements, and a papal promise to reduce certain inconvenient taxes. Rodrigo was essentially paying Ferrara to take Lucrezia off his hands, which should tell you something about either her reputation or the strategic importance of this particular alliance. But here's what made this marriage different from her previous arrangements. Alfonso d'Este wasn't some minor nobleman who could be discarded when he became inconvenient. He was the heir to one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, with enough military power to make even the Borgias think twice about casual murder. If they wanted this alliance to work, they were going to have to let Lucrezia's husband live long enough to be useful. Alfonso himself was an interesting character, a Renaissance man in the truest sense. He was a patron of the arts who collected paintings and commissioned sculptures, but he was also obsessed with artillery and spent his free time designing new types of cannons. He could discuss poetry with humanist scholars in the morning and test explosive devices in the afternoon. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person who might be able to handle being married to a Borgia. The wedding, held in December 1501 and February 1502, because Renaissance weddings were apparently too complicated to complete in a single ceremony, was a diplomatic spectacular that made previous Borgia marriages look like backyard barbecues. Representatives from every major power in Europe attended, partly to witness the ceremony and partly to gather intelligence on what the Borgias were planning next. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara like a conquering queen, with an entourage that included hundreds of servants, dozens of nobles, and enough luggage to stock a medium-sized city. Her trousseau was legendary. We're talking about clothes worth more than most people's houses, jewelry that required its own security detail, and personal effects that demonstrated the kind of wealth that made other Renaissance families feel poor by comparison. But the really interesting part wasn't the spectacle. It was how Lucrezia handled the transition. She wasn't just changing husbands, she was changing families, changing cities and changing roles. In Rome, she had been a Borgia first, and everything else second. In Ferrara, she needed to become an Este while somehow maintaining her Borgia connections. It was like being a double agent, except both sides knew exactly what she was doing. Alfonso, for his part, seemed genuinely charmed by his new wife. Unlike her previous husbands, He wasn't intimidated by her intelligence or her family connections. If anything, he seemed to appreciate both. He gave her significant autonomy in managing household affairs, included her in political discussions, and generally treated her as a partner rather than a possession. This was either very enlightened thinking or very sophisticated strategy. The early months of the marriage were surprisingly successful. Lucrezia adapted to Ferrara's court culture with the same intelligence she brought to everything else, learning the local customs, building relationships with key nobles, and generally behaving like a model duchess-in-waiting. Alfonso introduced her to his artillery experiments, and she showed genuine interest in both the technical and strategic implications of improved military technology. But the real test came when Borgia family business started interfering with Este family interests. Cesare's military campaigns were creating complications for Ferrara's foreign policy. Rodrigo's papal decrees were affecting Ferrara's trade relationships, and everyone was waiting to see whether Lucrezia's primary loyalty was to her birth family or her married family. This was the moment when previous Borgia marriages had started falling apart. Giovanni Sforza had chosen his family's interests over Borgia demands, and ended up divorced and exiled. Alfonso of Aragon had chosen Neapolitan loyalty over Roman politics and ended up dead. The pattern was clear. Borgia in-laws who prioritized other relationships over Borgia relationships didn't tend to have long, healthy lives. Alfonso d'Este, however, had advantages his predecessors lacked. He had real military power, he had diplomatic connections throughout Europe, and he had a father who was still officially in charge and wouldn't appreciate having his heir murdered by his in-laws. Most importantly, he seemed to understand that managing Borgia relationships required a delicate balance of cooperation and independence. The question was whether Lucrezia would help him maintain that balance, or whether her Borgia loyalty would ultimately prove stronger than her marriage vows. The answer would determine not just the fate of their marriage, but the future of both their families and the political landscape of Renaissance Italy. And as 150 dawned, that answer was about to be tested in ways that no one could have anticipated. August 18, 1503. Pope Alexander VI, better known as Rodrigo Borgia, patriarch of history's most dysfunctional family, suddenly died after attending a dinner party. Cause of death was officially listed as fever, but considering this was a man who had spent decades poisoning his political enemies, the irony was not lost on anyone. Whether he died from natural causes, accidental self-poisoning, or deliberate murder, one thing was immediately clear: the Borgia Empire was about to collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The timing couldn't have been worse for the family. Cesare was desperately ill, possibly from the same thing that killed his father, and was in no condition to manage the political crisis that was about to unfold. The papal armies were scattered across Italy, the treasury was nearly empty despite years of aggressive fundraising, and every enemy the Borgias had made over the past decade was sharpening their knives and preparing for revenge. For Lucrezia, sitting safely in Ferrara and probably receiving the news via frantic messenger, this was the moment of truth. Her entire identity had been built around being a Borgia. But now the Borgia name was becoming a liability rather than an asset. She could try to help her family weather the crisis, potentially dragging Ferrara into a war they couldn't win, or she could focus on protecting her new life and let the Borgia Empire burn. The conclave to elect the new pope was like watching vultures fight over a carcass. Except the vultures were cardinals, and the carcass was the future of the Catholic Church. Every faction that had been suppressed during Rodrigo's reign saw this as their chance for revenge. The Spanish cardinals wanted a Spanish pope, the French cardinals wanted French influence, and the Italian cardinals wanted to prevent any foreign domination of the papacy. What none of them wanted was another Borgia. Cesare, despite being barely able to stand, tried desperately to maintain control of the situation. He had made agreements with various cardinal factions, he had promises from foreign powers, and he had enough dirt on enough people to fill several blackmail encyclopedias, but he was no longer negotiating from a position of strength. His father was dead, his armies were deserting, and his treasury was empty. He was trying to play political chess, while bleeding out on the board. The first papal election produced Pius III, a compromise candidate who lasted exactly 26 days before dying of old age and general exhaustion. This brief papacy was like an intermission in a very dramatic play. Everyone used the time to reposition themselves for the next act. Cesare tried to recover his health and rebuild his alliances. His enemies tried to figure out how to eliminate him permanently. and Lucrezia tried to figure out which side was going to win. The second election was the one that mattered. Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who had spent years in exile because of his hatred for the Borgias, emerged as Pope Julius II. This was like electing Cesare's personal nemesis to the most powerful position in Europe. Julius II wasn't just going to reverse Borgia policies, he was going to systematically destroy everything they had built, and probably try to eliminate every family member he could find. For Cesare, this was a death sentence. Julius II immediately began seizing Borgia territories, arresting Borgia allies, and making it clear that any reconciliation was impossible. Cesare's brilliant military career, his carefully constructed alliances, and his dreams of creating a unified Italian kingdom all collapsed within months of his father's death. He went from being the most feared man in Italy to being a desperate exile begging for protection from foreign powers. But here's where Lucrezia's story takes an interesting turn. Instead of trying to save her family, she chose to save herself. She threw herself into her role as Alfonso's wife, and the future Duchess of Ferrara with an energy that suggested she was genuinely relieved to be done with Borgia politics. She cut her political ties to Rome, stopped corresponding with Cesare, and began building relationships within the Este family and Ferrarese nobility. This wasn't necessarily betrayal, it was survival. Lucrezia had spent her entire life watching family members die for political reasons, and she wasn't about to become the next casualty. Alfonso and his father Ercole made it clear that they would protect her as long as she focused on being an Este rather than a Borgia. It was an offer she couldn't refuse, assuming she wanted to live long enough to enjoy her marriage. The transformation was remarkable. Within a year of her father's death, Lucrezia had essentially reinvented herself. She stopped dressing like a papal princess and started dressing like a Ferrarese noblewoman. She stopped hosting the kind of glittering diplomatic receptions that had made her famous in Rome, and started participating in the more subdued cultural life of Ferrara. She even stopped using certain Borgia symbols and heraldic devices, symbolically divorcing herself from her family's legacy. Alfonso, to his credit, seems to have genuinely supported this transformation. He never pressured her to choose between her birth family and her married family, but he made it clear that her future lay with Ferrara rather than Rome. He gave her increasing responsibility in managing Este affairs, included her in decisions about everything from military strategy to artistic patronage, and generally treated her as if she had always been an Este. Meanwhile, Cesare's situation continued to deteriorate. He fled to Spain, where he was briefly imprisoned by Ferdinand of Aragon. He eventually escaped and tried to rebuild his career in the service of the King of Navarre. But his health was broken, and his reputation was destroyed. The man who had once seemed destined to rule all of Italy ended up dying in an obscure battle in 1507, essentially forgotten by the world he had once terrified. Lucrezia probably learned of her brother's death with mixed emotions. There's no record of her reaction, which suggests either that she had genuinely moved beyond caring about Borgia family affairs, or that she was wise enough not to express any public sentiment that might complicate her position in Ferrara. The Borgia era was over. The question now was whether Lucrezia could successfully complete her transformation from dangerous papal daughter to respectable Italian duchess. By 1505, Lucrezia Borgia had achieved something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. She had become genuinely respectable. Not fake respectable, not politically expedient respectable, but actually authentically respectable. It was like watching a reformed con artist become a successful banker, theoretically possible, but practically miraculous. And yet, there she was, the Duchess of Ferrara, beloved by her subjects, and apparently content with a life that didn't involve poison or political assassination. The death of Alfonso's father, Ercole de Tosti, in 1505, marked the beginning of Lucrezia's transformation from Duchess-in-waiting to actual ruler. Alfonso became Duke of Ferrara, and Lucrezia became one of the most powerful women in Italian politics. But instead of using this power to resurrect Borgia ambitions or launch new schemes for European domination, she did something completely unexpected. She became an excellent duchess. Ferrara under Alfonso and Lucrezia's joint rule became a Renaissance success story. The city-state was wealthy, culturally vibrant, diplomatically secure, and generally well-governed. Lucrezia threw herself into the role of cultural patron with the same intelligence and energy she had once devoted to political intrigue. She attracted artists, poets, writers, and musicians to Ferrara, creating one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. But this wasn't just about collecting famous people like trophies. Lucrezia engaged with Renaissance culture at a level that demonstrated genuine intellectual curiosity and artistic understanding. She corresponded with Pietro Bembo about poetic theory. She commissioned paintings from major artists, she supported experimental theatrical productions, and she participated in philosophical discussions that influenced humanist thought across Europe. Her relationship with Pietro Bembo, which had begun during her widowhood, evolved into one of the great intellectual partnerships of the Renaissance. Their correspondence reveals a woman who could discuss complex theological questions, analyze classical literature, and engage with contemporary philosophical debates on equal terms with the greatest minds of her age. This wasn't the result of having good tutors. This was genuine brilliance applied to subjects that had nothing to do with political power. Meanwhile, her marriage to Alfonso was developing in ways that surprised everyone, including probably Alfonso and Lucrezia themselves. They had started as a political arrangement, but they were becoming something approaching a love match. Alfonso genuinely respected his wife's intelligence and capabilities, while Lucrezia seemed to appreciate having a husband who treated her as an intellectual equal, rather than a political asset. They worked together effectively on everything from military strategy to economic policy. Alfonso handled the technical aspects of governance, military engineering, trade negotiations, diplomatic relations, while Lucrezia focused on cultural development, internal administration, and what we might now call public relations. It was a partnership that played to both of their strengths, while covering both of their weaknesses. The really remarkable thing was how completely Lucrezia had adapted to Pharisee culture. She learned the local dialects, she participated in local religious observances, she supported local charitable institutions, and she generally behaved as if she had been born in Ferrara rather than raised in the Vatican. This wasn't just political calculation by all accounts. She genuinely seemed to enjoy her new life and new identity. But perhaps most surprisingly, she was becoming a devoted mother. By 1508, she had given birth to several children with Alfonso, and she threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Unlike many Renaissance noblewomen, who typically handed child-rearing responsibilities off to servants, Lucrezia was actively involved in her children's education and upbringing. This was particularly notable, given her own childhood experience. She could have easily perpetuated the Borgia approach to parenting, treating children as political assets to be trained for strategic purposes, but instead she seemed determined to give her children something approaching a normal Renaissance noble childhood. They learned languages and arts, certainly, but they also learned to think of themselves as estes first and political figures second. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was political as well. Ferrara's international reputation improved dramatically during these years, partly because other European powers realized they could negotiate with Alfonso and Lucrezia without worrying about being poisoned during the treaty negotiations. The duchy became known for diplomatic reliability rather than creative treachery, which was a significant change from the Borgia approach to international relations. Lucrezia's correspondence from this period reveals someone who had found a level of contentment that would have been unimaginable during her Roman years. She wrote about artistic projects with genuine enthusiasm. She discussed her children's development with obvious maternal pride, and she seemed to take real satisfaction in the administrative details of running a successful duchy. But the most telling evidence of her transformation was how she handled the few attempts to drag her back into the kind of political intrigue that had defined her youth. When various powers tried to use her Borgia connections for their own purposes, she politely but firmly declined to participate. When former associates suggested she might want to take revenge on the enemies who had destroyed her family, she showed no interest. She had chosen her new life over her old one, and she was sticking with that choice. This raises fascinating questions about the nature of personality and the possibility of genuine change. Was Lucrezia Borgia naturally inclined toward the kind of ruthless political behavior that characterized her family, or was she simply adapting to the environment she found herself in? Was her transformation in Ferrara evidence of her true character finally being able to emerge, or was it just another form of strategic adaptation? The answer is probably both. Lucrezia had always been intelligent and adaptable. Those were the qualities that had made her useful to her family's political schemes. But in Ferrara she was finally in an environment where those same qualities could be used for constructive, rather than destructive purposes. She was still playing politics, but she was playing a different kind of game, with different rules and different objectives. By 1510 the transformation was complete. Lucrezia Borgia, the legendary poisoner of Renaissance lore, had become Lucrezia d'Este, respected duchess and cultural patron. The question was whether this new identity could survive the challenges that lay ahead. Because in Renaissance Italy, even the most peaceful periods were temporary, and even the most respectable duchies could find themselves at war. Just when Lucrezia thought she had successfully escaped the Borgia family tradition of violent political chaos, Renaissance Italy decided to remind her that geography is destiny, and Ferrara was still very much located in the middle of the most politically unstable region in Europe. By 1510, the Italian wars were reaching a crescendo of complexity that made previous conflicts look like children's games. Everyone was fighting everyone else. Alliances changed faster than Renaissance fashion trends, and Ferrara found itself in the uncomfortable position of being strategically important to all sides. The League of Cambrai, formed in 1508, was supposed to be a simple alliance aimed at limiting Venetian expansion. Pope Julius II, King Louis XII of France, Emperor Maximilian I, and King Ferdinand of Spain all agreed that Venice had gotten too big for its maritime boots and needed to be taken down a few pegs. It was a rare moment of international cooperation, except that it immediately fell apart when the Allies realized they all had different ideas about what should happen after Venice was defeated. Alfonso d'Este, demonstrating either remarkable political insight or spectacular bad judgment, decided to ally with France against the Pope. This put him in direct opposition to Julius II, the same Pope who had spent years destroying Borgia power and who was not particularly fond of anyone associated with that family name. The fact that Alfonso's wife was a Borgia probably didn't help his case when Julius II was deciding which Italian rulers deserved papal support. For Lucrezia, this was a nightmare scenario. She had spent years carefully distancing herself from her family's legacy and building a new identity as a respectable duchess. Now her husband was dragging them into exactly the kind of high-stakes political conflict that had destroyed her father and brother. It was like escaping from a burning building, only to discover that your new house was built on top of a volcano. The military situation deteriorated rapidly. French armies marched through northern Italy. Papal forces advanced from the south, and various Italian city-states picked sides based on whichever alliance seemed most likely to keep them alive until next Tuesday. Alfonso, who had inherited his father's passion for military engineering, threw himself into the war effort with enthusiasm that probably worried his more diplomatically minded wife. Ferrara's artillery corps, trained by Alfonso himself, became legendary during these campaigns. The Duke had spent years perfecting new cannon designs and training techniques, and his forces were arguably the most effective artillery units in Europe. But military excellence, as the Borgias had learned the hard way, was no substitute for political wisdom when you were surrounded by enemies. By 1512, the situation had become untenable. Julius II had convinced the Holy League to turn their attention from Venice to France, which meant that Alfonso's French allies were suddenly facing a coalition that included the Pope, Spain, Venice, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Ferrara went from being on the winning side of a regional conflict to being virtually alone against most of Europe. Lucrezia found herself in an impossible position. As Duchess, her duty was to support her husband's political decisions and help defend their duchy. As a former Borgia, she understood better than most how quickly military situations could become diplomatic disasters, and diplomatic disasters could become personal tragedies. She had already lost one husband to political violence. She was not eager to lose another. The siege of Ferrara, which began in earnest in 1512, was a brutal affair that tested everyone's resolve. The city was bombarded by papal artillery, French reinforcements were blocked by enemy forces, and food supplies ran dangerously low. Alfonso spent his days directing the defense and his nights designing new fortifications, while Lucrezia managed civilian morale and coordinated relief efforts. This was Lucrezia's first real test as a ruler during wartime, and she proved remarkably effective. She organized food distribution, managed refugee housing, coordinated medical care for wounded soldiers, and generally kept the civilian population from panicking, despite being under constant bombardment. It turns out that the skills she had developed managing Borgia political crises translated well to managing military crises. But the most interesting aspect of her wartime leadership was how she handled diplomatic communications. Several attempts were made to negotiate directly with her, presumably because various parties thought she might be more flexible than her husband or more susceptible to threats because of her Borgia background. These negotiations revealed a woman who had learned to balance loyalty with pragmatism and personal commitment with political necessity. Lucrezia's responses to these diplomatic overtures were masterful examples of Renaissance statecraft. She managed to keep communication channels open without betraying her husband's position, to express appropriate respect for papal authority without agreeing to papal demands, and to maintain her dignity without unnecessarily provoking her enemies. It was the kind of delicate diplomatic dance that would have made Rodrigo Borgia proud, except she was using these skills to protect rather than destroy. The war finally ended in 1513 with the Treaty of Blois, which restored most of Ferrara's territory in exchange for various concessions and tribute payments. Alfonso and Lucrezia had managed to survive being on the wrong side of a major European conflict, which was no small achievement in Renaissance politics. But the experience had changed both of them in ways that would affect the rest of their reign. Alfonso emerged from the war with enhanced respect for his wife's political capabilities, and a deeper appreciation for the complexity of international relations. He had learned that military excellence was not sufficient for political survival, and that diplomatic skills were just as important as artillery skills. Lucrezia emerged from the war with something she had never had before: genuine confidence in her own abilities as a ruler. She had proven to herself and others that she could handle the kind of crisis that destroyed lesser leaders. More importantly, she had done it without reverting to the Borgia approach of solving problems through violence and deception. The successful defense of Ferrara marked the end of Lucrezia's apprenticeship as a duchess and the beginning of her career as one of the most effective rulers of the Renaissance. The question now was what she would do with that hard-won experience and confidence. If social media had existed in the Renaissance, Lucrezia d'Este would have been the ultimate influencer. By 1515, she had built a network of relationships that spanned from the highest levels of European politics to the most innovative circles of Renaissance art and literature. But unlike modern influencers, her platform wasn't built on lifestyle content and product placement. It was built on genuine intellectual engagement, strategic philanthropy, and the kind of cultural patronage that could make or break artistic careers. The Ferrara court under Lucrezia's influence became the Renaissance equivalent of a modern think tank, crossed with an artist residency program. She didn't just collect famous people, she created an environment where artists, writers, philosophers, and diplomats could interact in ways that produced genuine innovation. It was like running a salon, except the guests included some of the most influential minds in Europe, and the conversations shaped cultural and political developments across the continent. Her relationship with Pietro Bembo had evolved into something unprecedented in Renaissance culture, a genuine intellectual partnership between a man and woman that was recognized and respected by their contemporaries. Their correspondence, which continued even after Bembo moved to other courts, influenced literary theory, philosophical discourse, and even theological debate. Bembo would later become a cardinal, but during his time in Ferrara, he was essentially Lucrezia's intellectual co-conspirator. But Bembo was just one node in a network that included some of the most interesting people of the age. Ludovico Ariosto, whose epic poem, Orlando Furioso, became one of the masterpieces of Renaissance literature, was a regular at Lucrezia's court and dedicated his work to her. This wasn't just conventional flattery. Ariosto genuinely valued her literary opinions and incorporated her suggestions into his revisions. Titian painted her portrait multiple times, and their working relationship reveals an artist and patron who collaborated as equals, rather than following the typical Renaissance model of wealthy patron dictating terms to grateful artist. Lucrezia understood painting technique well enough to discuss artistic choices intelligently, and Titian respected her aesthetic judgment enough to take her suggestions seriously. The musical life of Ferrara under Lucrezia's patronage was equally remarkable. She attracted composers from across Europe, and supported experimental musical forms that pushed the boundaries of Renaissance musical theory. Her court concerts weren't just entertainment, they were research and development sessions where new musical ideas were tested and refined. This cultural networking had political implications that extended far beyond artistic achievement. When you're hosting the most interesting dinner parties in Renaissance Europe, everyone wants an invitation. Diplomatic representatives would extend their stays in Ferrara just to participate in court cultural events. Artists would carry messages between courts, writers would influence public opinion through their works, and musicians would spread Ferrara's cultural influence wherever they performed. Lucrezia understood something that many political leaders miss. Culture is soft power, and soft power can be more effective than military force for achieving long-term strategic objectives. By making Ferrara the cultural center of northern Italy, she was making the duchy politically indispensable. You couldn't eliminate Ferrara without destroying something that the educated elite across Europe valued and wanted to preserve. Her approach to religious patronage was equally sophisticated. She supported religious art and architecture not just out of piety, but as a way of demonstrating Ferrara's orthodoxy and political reliability. After the wars with Pope Julius II, it was important to show that the d'Este family were good Catholics who deserved papal support rather than papal persecution. Lucrezia commissioned religious works that were both artistically innovative and theologically impeccable. But perhaps most impressively, she managed to maintain relationships with people across the political spectrum without compromising her loyalty to Ferrara. She corresponded with French nobles who had been Alfonso's allies, Spanish diplomats who had been Alfonso's enemies, and papal officials who had tried to destroy her duchy. She did this not through duplicity, but through the kind of personal charm and intellectual engagement that transcended political differences. This required an almost superhuman level of emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. Every letter she wrote, every conversation she had, every cultural event she hosted, had to be carefully calibrated to advance Ferrara's interests without alienating powerful people who might be useful in the future. It was like playing three-dimensional chess while hosting a dinner party and composing poetry. The economic implications of her cultural networking were significant as well. Artists, writers, and musicians brought money into Ferrara's economy. Cultural events attracted wealthy visitors who spent money on local goods and services. The duchy's reputation for cultural sophistication attracted merchants and bankers who wanted to be associated with prestigious artistic projects. More subtly, Lucrezia's cultural activities provided excellent cover for intelligence gathering. When you're hosting scholars from across Europe, you naturally learn about political developments in their home countries. When you're corresponding with artists who work for multiple patrons, you get insights into the internal politics of rival courts. When you're supporting writers who travel widely, you develop sources of information that rival any diplomatic intelligence network. By 1520, Lucrezia had created something unique in Renaissance Europe, a court that was simultaneously culturally innovative, politically secure, economically prosperous, and diplomatically influential. She had proven that a relatively small Italian duchy could punch above its weight through strategic cultural investment and intelligent relationship building. But the most remarkable aspect of her achievement was how completely she had reinvented herself while doing it. The woman who had been raised to be a political weapon had become a cultural catalyst. The daughter who had been trained for strategic marriage and dynastic reproduction had become an intellectual force in her own right. The Borgia who had been expected to use people for political advantage had become a patron who genuinely supported artistic and intellectual achievement. This transformation wasn't just personal, it was historically significant. Lucrezia was creating a new model for female political leadership that combined traditional feminine roles with genuine intellectual authority and cultural influence. She was proving that women could be effective rulers not just through manipulation and intrigue, but through intelligence, creativity, and genuine leadership ability. The question was whether this model could survive the challenges that were coming. Because in Renaissance Italy, even the most successful cultural golden ages were temporary, and even the most sophisticated courts could be destroyed by changing political circumstances. Nothing quite prepares you for the Renaissance approach to childbirth, which was essentially a combination of prayer, medieval medical theory, and hoping for the best. For Lucrezia, who by 1520 had already experienced the joys of multiple pregnancies in an era when maternal mortality rates were roughly equivalent to combat casualty rates, each birth was both a political necessity and a personal gamble with death. But motherhood in the d'Este household wasn't just about producing heirs, it was about creating the next generation of Renaissance leaders. Lucrezia's approach to raising her children revealed yet another layer of her remarkable adaptability. She could have easily perpetuated the Borgia approach to child-rearing, treating her offspring as political assets to be trained for strategic advantage. Instead, she chose something far more radical for the Renaissance. She tried to give them actual childhoods while still preparing them for the responsibilities they would inherit. Her eldest son, Ercole d'Este, born in 1508, became a particular focus of her maternal attention. Unlike her father Rodrigo, who had viewed his children primarily through the lens of political utility, Lucrezia seemed genuinely interested in Ercole's personality and individual development. She oversaw his education personally, ensuring he learned not just the standard noble curriculum of languages and military arts, but also developing genuine intellectual curiosity and cultural appreciation. This was revolutionary parenting for the Renaissance elite. Most noble children were raised primarily by servants and tutors, with parents appearing mainly for ceremonial occasions and strategic decisions. Lucrezia was actively involved in her children's daily lives, participating in their lessons, discussing their interests, and generally behaving like what we would recognize as an engaged modern parent. But she wasn't soft or sentimental about their education. Urkel and his siblings learned early that they were deities first and everything else second. They studied the family's history, understood their territorial responsibilities, and were trained from childhood to think strategically about political relationships. The difference was that Lucrezia taught them these lessons through example and explanation rather than through fear and manipulation. Her letters from this period reveal a woman wrestling with the fundamental challenge of Renaissance parenthood: how to prepare children for a world that might require ruthlessness while encouraging them to develop genuine moral principles. She wanted her children to be strong enough to survive Italian politics, but decent enough to be worth surviving for. The health challenges of Renaissance motherhood took an increasingly serious toll on Lucrezia. As she entered her 30s, multiple pregnancies combined with the limited medical knowledge of the era left her frequently ill and increasingly fragile. By 1518, court observers were noting that the Duchess appeared unwell more often than not, though she continued to maintain her cultural and political activities with characteristic determination. Modern medical analysis of the historical records suggests that Lucrezia may have suffered from what we would now recognize as complications from multiple pregnancies, possibly including infections, nutritional deficiencies, and the cumulative physical stress of bearing children in an era when prenatal care consisted mainly of prayer and dietary restrictions. Renaissance medicine's approach to women's health was, to put it charitably, inadequate. But despite her declining health, Lucrezia continued to expand her intellectual and cultural activities. If anything, her awareness of mortality seemed to intensify her commitment to leaving a lasting cultural legacy. She increased her patronage of artists and writers, expanded her correspondence with scholars across Europe, and threw herself into educational projects that would outlive her personal involvement. Her relationship with Alfonso during this period reveals a marriage that had genuinely evolved beyond political convenience into something approaching partnership and mutual affection. Alfonso, who had initially married her for strategic reasons, became increasingly protective of her health and supportive of her intellectual pursuits. When court physicians recommended that she reduce her activities, Alfonso backed her decision to ignore their advice and continue with her cultural projects. This wasn't just romantic devotion, it was political pragmatism. Alfonso had learned that Lucrezia's cultural networking and diplomatic relationships were essential to Ferrara's security and prosperity. He understood that forcing her to retreat from public life would damage not just her personal happiness, but the duchy's strategic interests. The letters between Lucrezia and her various correspondents during this period reveal increasing preoccupation with legacy and permanence. She began commissioning works that would memorialize not just her own achievements, but the cultural flowering that had occurred during her time as Duchess. She was creating what we might now call a strategic cultural memory project, ensuring that her contributions would be remembered and valued by future generations. But perhaps most remarkably, she was also working to establish institutional frameworks that would preserve Ferrara's cultural prominence, even after her death. She helped establish educational programs that would continue her work with young scholars, created funding mechanisms for artistic projects that would outlast her personal patronage, and built relationships with cultural institutions across Europe that would maintain connections regardless of political changes. This forward-thinking approach to cultural legacy was unusual for Renaissance nobles, who typically focused on immediate political advantages rather than long-term institutional development. Lucrezia was essentially trying to ensure that the cultural renaissance she had fostered in Ferrara would become self-sustaining rather than dependent on her personal involvement. Her health continued to deteriorate throughout the early 1520s, but her intellectual engagement remained as sharp as ever. She continued to correspond with scholars, commission artistic works, and participate in the kind of high-level cultural discourse that had made her famous across Europe. It was as if she was racing against time to complete all the projects and relationships that she had initiated during her years as Duchess. By 1519, it was becoming clear that Lucrezia's time was limited. Court physicians were frank about their inability to improve her condition, and she began making the kind of preparations that suggested she understood what was coming. But instead of retreating from public life, she intensified her activities, as if determined to compress a lifetime of additional achievement into whatever time remained. The woman who had survived being raised by the most dangerous family in Renaissance Europe was facing an enemy that couldn't be outmaneuvered, outlasted, or eliminated through political strategy. For perhaps the first time in her life, Lucrezia Borgia was confronting a problem that couldn't be solved through intelligence, charm, or strategic thinking. June 1519. Lucrezia d'Este, formerly Borgia, lay dying in her chambers at the Ferrara castle, surrounded by the cultural treasures she had collected and the artistic works she had commissioned during nearly 2 decades as Duchess. At 39, she was old by Renaissance standards, but young by any reasonable measure, and her impending death seemed to surprise everyone, except possibly herself. She had always been remarkably good at reading situations accurately, and mortality, it turned out, was just another political reality that required careful management. The cause of her final illness remains historically unclear, though it was probably related to complications from her 10th pregnancy. Renaissance obstetrics was, to put it kindly, more art than science, and repeated pregnancies often led to infections, malnutrition, and systemic health problems that medieval medicine couldn't address effectively. But whatever was killing her, Lucrezia approached it with the same strategic intelligence she had brought to every other challenge in her life. Her deathbed became, in effect, a final diplomatic reception. Representatives from courts across Europe came to pay their respects, ostensibly out of concern for her health, but actually to position themselves for whatever political changes her death might precipitate. Artists and writers who had benefited from her patronage arrived to express their gratitude and secure their positions with Alfonso and the next generation of d'Este leadership. Lucrezia managed these final social obligations with characteristic skill, even while obviously weakening. She received visitors who could be useful to Ferrara's future, declined to see those who couldn't, and generally orchestrated her final weeks as carefully as she had managed her most important cultural events. It was a masterclass in political theatre, performed by someone who understood that even dying could be a diplomatic opportunity. Her letters from this period, dictated to secretaries when she became too weak to write, reveal someone who was primarily concerned with ensuring continuity, rather than dwelling on personal mortality. She provided detailed instructions for ongoing cultural projects, made recommendations for future artistic commissions, and wrote carefully worded messages to key political figures that would help maintain Ferrara's international relationships after her death. But perhaps most remarkably, she also wrote personal letters to her children that revealed a more intimate side of her personality. These letters, preserved in the d'Este family archives, show a mother trying to compress a lifetime of guidance into final instructions. She advised Urkel on political strategy, encouraged her daughters to develop their intellectual interests, and generally tried to prepare them for lives that would be shaped by their d'Este identity rather than their Borgia heritage. The contrast with her father's death was striking. Rodrigo Borgia had died suddenly, leaving behind political chaos and incomplete schemes. Lucrezia was dying gradually, with enough time to arrange for orderly transition and succession planning. She used her final months to ensure that the cultural and political achievements of her reign would survive her personal absence. Alfonso, meanwhile, was discovering what it meant to lose not just a wife but a governing partner. He had become accustomed to sharing political responsibilities with someone whose intelligence and diplomatic skills complemented his own strength. Lucrezia's illness forced him to confront the reality that he would need to find new ways to manage the cultural and diplomatic aspects of ducal responsibility that she had handled so effectively. The broader European political community was also preparing for the implications of her death. Lucrezia had become a significant figure in Renaissance diplomacy, not just as Alfonso's wife but as an independent political actor whose opinions and relationships mattered. Her correspondence network included some of the most influential people in Europe, and her cultural patronage had created connections that transcended political boundaries. Foreign diplomats began positioning themselves to maintain access to Ferrara through other channels. Artists started cultivating relationships with other potential patrons, and writers began crafting elegant memorial pieces that would demonstrate their appreciation for Lucrezia's support, while advertising their availability for future commissions. It was the Renaissance version of networking during a transition period. But the most interesting aspect of Lucrezia's final months was how she handled the question of her own historical legacy. She was acutely aware that she would be remembered primarily as a Borgia, and that the Borgia name carried associations with poison, corruption, and political murder. She used her remaining time to try to shape how she would be remembered by commissioning works that emphasized her cultural achievements and political successes rather than her family background. This was sophisticated reputation management for someone on her deathbed. She arranged for scholars to write accounts of her cultural patronage, encouraged artists to create works that would memorialize her intellectual achievements, and generally tried to ensure that future historians would have access to evidence of her positive contributions, rather than just scandalous stories about her relatives. Her final conversations with Pietro Bembo, who had remained one of her closest intellectual companions throughout their long correspondence, reveal someone who was genuinely concerned about the future of Renaissance cultural development. She worried that her death might lead to a decline in Ferrara's cultural prominence, and she spent considerable energy trying to establish institutional arrangements that would preserve the city's artistic and intellectual achievements. On June 24, 1519, Lucrezia d'Este died quietly in her sleep, surrounded by family members and attended by the best physicians available in Renaissance Europe. Her death was peaceful by the standards of the era, which was itself remarkable given the violence that had characterized so much of her family's history. She had managed to die of natural causes in her own bed, which was more than most Borgias could claim. Alfonso's grief appears to have been genuine and profound. He continued many of her cultural projects, maintained correspondence with scholars and artists she had supported, and generally tried to preserve the intellectual environment she had created in Ferrara. But it was clear that something essential had been lost with her death. A combination of intelligence, diplomatic skill, and cultural vision that couldn't easily be replaced. The funeral arrangements reflected both her d'Este identity and her remarkable personal achievements. She was buried with full ducal honors, celebrated as a cultural patron and political leader, rather than simply as a nobleman's wife. The ceremony attracted representatives from across Europe, and provided one final opportunity for Ferrara to demonstrate the international respect that Lucrezia had helped the duchy achieve. But the real measure of her legacy would be determined by what happened next. Whether the cultural renaissance she had fostered could survive her death, and whether the political relationships she had built would outlast her personal involvement. Here's the fundamental question that haunts any serious examination of Lucrezia Borgia's life. Was she a victim of her family's ambitions, who managed to transcend her circumstances, or was she an enthusiastic participant in Renaissance political corruption, who simply got better at public relations? The answer, like most things about the Borgias, is probably both more complex and more disturbing than we'd like to believe. Let's consider the evidence for Lucrezia as victim. She was born into a family that viewed children as political assets rather than individuals deserving of love and protection. She was married off at 13 to advance her father's diplomatic goals, divorced when that marriage became politically inconvenient, and remarried to serve different strategic objectives. She watched her second husband murdered by her own brother, and was expected to continue family loyalty as if nothing had happened. By any reasonable standard, this constitutes systematic abuse. Her childhood education, while remarkably sophisticated, was essentially training for manipulation and strategic deception. She learned to read people, not for empathy or understanding, but for advantage and exploitation. She was taught to view relationships as transactional arrangements rather than emotional connections. The skills that made her an effective political operator were the same skills that would have made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. From this perspective, her transformation in Ferrara represents a remarkable triumph over her conditioning. She managed to break free from the Borgia approach to relationships and politics, developing genuine affection for her husband, authentic care for her subjects, and real intellectual curiosity about art and literature. She used her intelligence and diplomatic skills for constructive rather than destructive purposes, creating cultural value rather than political chaos. But then consider the evidence for Lucrezia. As willing participant, she never showed any apparent distress about her family's methods during her Roman years. She adapted seamlessly to each new political role, suggesting either remarkable resilience or comfortable familiarity with moral flexibility. She maintained family loyalty even after watching Sizia murder her husband, which implies either extraordinary forgiveness or disturbing acceptance of violence as normal. Her later success in Ferrara could be interpreted not as moral transformation, but as strategic adaptation. She had learned from her family's mistakes that excessive violence created too many enemies. that cultural patronage was more effective than political terror for maintaining power, and that appearing respectable was more useful than being genuinely feared. From this perspective, she was still playing the same game. She had just gotten better at the rules. The truth probably lies somewhere between these interpretations. Lucrezia was simultaneously victim and participant, shaped by circumstances beyond her control, but also making conscious choices about how to respond to those circumstances. She had been trained to be ruthless, but she chose to channel that training toward cultural and political achievement rather than personal vengeance or family restoration. What makes her story particularly fascinating is how it illuminates the broader contradictions of Renaissance culture. This was an era that produced unprecedented artistic and intellectual achievement, alongside systematic political violence and moral corruption. The same patronage system that supported Michelangelo and Leonardo also funded armies and assassinations. The same humanist philosophy that celebrated individual dignity also justified princely absolutism and dynastic warfare. Lucrezia embodied these contradictions perfectly. She was a product of the most corrupt political family in European history, who became a genuine patron of Renaissance culture. She was trained in manipulation and deception, who used those skills to create lasting artistic and intellectual value. She was a woman who had experienced horrific personal losses, who chose to build rather than destroy with her remaining years. Her success in Ferrara also raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between power and morality. Was her cultural patronage genuinely altruistic, or was it simply a more sophisticated form of political manipulation? Did she support artists and scholars because she valued their work, or because cultural prestige was useful for diplomatic and economic purposes? The available evidence suggests it was probably both, that she had learned to align her personal interests with broader social benefits. This alignment of self-interest with cultural value was perhaps her greatest achievement. Unlike her father and brother, who pursued power for its own sake and left behind mainly destruction, Lucrezia found ways to exercise influence that created lasting positive value. The artists she supported, the scholars she corresponded with, and the cultural institutions she fostered outlived her personal ambitions and continued to benefit society long after her death. But we should be careful not to romanticize her transformation too much. Even in Ferrara, Lucrezia remained a Renaissance political leader, which meant making decisions that modern audiences would find morally problematic. She supported warfare when it served Ferrara's interests. She maintained relationships with people whose methods she disapproved of when those relationships were useful, and she generally prioritized political effectiveness over moral purity. The real question isn't whether Lucrezia was good or evil. Renaissance categories that don't map well onto complex historical figures, but whether she used her capabilities for constructive or destructive purposes. By that measure, her later years represent a genuine transformation from someone who participated in political destruction to someone who created cultural and political value. Perhaps most importantly, her story demonstrates the possibility of change and growth, even for people shaped by the most difficult circumstances. She proved that intelligence and adaptability could be used for creation as well as destruction, that political skills could serve cultural rather than purely selfish purposes, and that even members of history's most notorious families could choose different paths. The Borgia name will always be associated with Renaissance corruption and violence, and Lucrezia will always be remembered as part of that legacy. But her later achievements suggest that family background, however dramatic, doesn't have to determine individual destiny. She managed to transform herself from a political weapon into a cultural catalyst, from a family asset into an independent leader, and from a symbol of corruption into a patron of genuine artistic and intellectual achievement. That transformation required not just intelligence and determination, but also the kind of moral courage that chooses construction over destruction, creation over revenge, and hope over cynicism. Whatever else we might say about Lucrezia Borgia, she demonstrated that even the most damaged people can choose to use their capabilities for positive purposes if they find the right circumstances and make the right decisions. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson her story offers, that change is possible, that people are more than their worst circumstances, and that intelligence combined with opportunity can create value that outlasts the political systems that originally shaped it. The woman who died peacefully in Ferrara in 1519 bore little resemblance to the legendary poisoner of popular imagination. But legends have a way of becoming more compelling than facts, especially when they involve beautiful women, political intrigue, and family dysfunction. The myth of Lucrezia Borgia as Renaissance femme fatale was largely created by her enemies, embellished by later writers, and perpetuated by audiences who preferred sensational fiction to complex historical reality. The poison ring story is probably the most persistent myth associated with Lucrezia's name. According to legend, she wore a special ring with a hidden compartment that allowed her to discreetly add poison to her victims' drinks during dinner parties. It's a compelling image, the beautiful woman smiling sweetly while dealing death with a casual gesture. But there's absolutely no historical evidence that such a ring ever existed. The story appears to have been invented by hostile chroniclers and repeated by writers who valued dramatic impact over factual accuracy. Similarly, the tales of her numerous lovers and sexual scandals were largely products of political propaganda rather than documented reality. Renaissance political opponents routinely accused their enemies' female relatives of sexual impropriety as a way of discrediting entire families. The more powerful the family, the more outrageous the accusations became. The Borgias, being the most powerful family in Europe, naturally attracted the most extreme allegations. What's particularly interesting is how these myths evolved over time. 19th century romantic writers like Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas transformed Lucrezia from a political figure into a literary character, emphasizing the sensational and exotic aspects of her story while ignoring the more complex reality of her later achievements. Opera composers like Gaetano Donizetti created works that cemented the popular image of Lucrezia as a tragic but dangerous figure, beautiful but deadly. Hollywood and popular culture have continued this tradition, presenting Lucrezia as either a helpless victim of male ambition or a calculating seductress who used her beauty to manipulate powerful men. Both interpretations miss the more interesting reality. She was a highly intelligent political leader who learned to use cultural patronage and diplomatic skill to achieve her objectives. The real Lucrezia was neither victim nor villain, but something more complex, a Renaissance politician who happened to be female. The historical revision began in earnest during the 20th century, as scholars gained access to previously unavailable documents and applied more rigorous analytical methods to Renaissance sources. The d'Este family archives, opened to researchers in the 1900s, revealed hundreds of letters that showed Lucrezia's genuine intellectual interests and administrative capabilities. Diplomatic records from various European courts demonstrated her effectiveness as a negotiator and cultural ambassador. Modern historians have also developed better methods for distinguishing between contemporary propaganda and reliable evidence. They can identify which sources were written by political enemies, which accounts were based on hearsay rather than direct observation, and which stories were added to the historical record decades or centuries after the alleged events occurred. This more sophisticated approach to sources has systematically dismantled most of the sensational stories about Lucrezia's alleged crimes. But the revision process has created its own problems. Some modern historians, reacting against centuries of character assassination, have overcorrected by presenting Lucrezia as almost entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. This sanitized version is probably as inaccurate as the earlier demonized version. The real Lucrezia was a Renaissance political figure, which meant she operated according to moral standards that modern audiences would find problematic, regardless of her gender or family background. The truth seems to be that Lucrezia participated in the Borgia family's political activities during her youth, but was never the mastermind behind their schemes. She was trained to be useful to the family's ambitions, and she fulfilled that role effectively, but she was not the independent agent of destruction that popular legend suggests. When she gained the opportunity to exercise power independently in Ferrara, she chose to use it for cultural and political construction rather than personal revenge or family restoration. What's most striking about the historical revision is how it reveals the gendered assumptions that shaped earlier interpretations of her story. Male Renaissance political figures who engaged in violence and deception are typically described as ruthless but effective or products of their time. Female figures who engaged in similar behavior are described as evil or unnatural. Lucrezia's story demonstrates how historical interpretation can be distorted by assumptions about gender roles and appropriate feminine behavior. The real challenge in understanding Lucrezia is separating her individual choices and achievements from the broader context of Renaissance political culture. She lived in an era when political murder was common, when marriage was primarily a diplomatic tool, and when cultural patronage was often motivated by strategic rather than aesthetic considerations. Judging her by modern moral standards is anachronistic, but ignoring the moral dimensions of her choices is equally problematic. Perhaps the most balanced assessment is that Lucrezia was an exceptionally intelligent woman, who learned to navigate an exceptionally dangerous political environment. She made compromises and accommodations that allowed her to survive and eventually thrive, but she also made conscious choices about how to use her capabilities once she gained real independence. The evidence suggests that she chose construction over destruction, culture over violence, and diplomatic engagement over political revenge. The persistence of the myths about Lucrezia also reveals something important about how we prefer our historical figures. We're more comfortable with simple narratives, good versus evil, victim versus perpetrator, than with complex realities that resist easy categorization. Lucrezia's actual story is more interesting than the legendary version, but it's also more morally ambiguous and historically complicated. The legends will probably outlast the historical revision, just as they've outlasted centuries of scholarly correction. Popular culture prefers beautiful poisoners to effective administrators, tragic victims to successful politicians, and sensational scandals to cultural achievements. But for those willing to engage with the more complex reality, Lucrezia's actual story offers insights into Renaissance politics, gender roles, cultural patronage, and the possibility of personal transformation under difficult circumstances. In the end, perhaps the most important thing to understand about Lucrezia Borgia is that she was neither the monster of legend nor the saint of historical revision, but something more interesting. A real person who made real choices under extraordinary circumstances, and whose achievements deserve to be evaluated on their own merits, rather than through the filter of family reputation or gender expectations. If we strip away the myths, the propaganda, and the centuries of historical distortion, what emerges is perhaps the most remarkable story of personal reinvention in Renaissance history. Lucrezia Borgia transformed herself from a political pawn in history's most notorious family into one of the most effective cultural and political leaders of her era. But more than that, she created an entirely new model for female leadership that combined traditional Renaissance feminine roles with genuine intellectual authority and political independence. The traditional path for noble women in Renaissance Europe was straightforward: marry strategically, produce heirs, maintain household dignity, and exercise influence through male relatives. Political power was supposed to be indirect, cultural engagement was supposed to be decorative, and intellectual achievement was supposed to be subordinated to family interests. Lucrezia followed this path during her early years, but by her 30s, she had essentially rewritten the rules. In Ferrara, she demonstrated that a woman could be an effective, direct ruler rather than just an influential wife. She made administrative decisions independently, conducted diplomatic negotiations on her own authority, and managed significant cultural and economic programs without constant male supervision. This wasn't just unusual for the Renaissance, it was revolutionary. Her approach to cultural patronage also broke new ground. Most Renaissance patrons, male or female, commissioned works that reflected their own glory or advanced their family's political interests. Lucrezia supported artists and scholars who were genuinely innovative, even when their work didn't directly benefit her personally. She seemed to understand that cultural achievement had value independent of political utility, a remarkably modern concept for the 16th century. Perhaps most importantly, she proved that intelligence and education could be more effective tools for political survival than violence and intimidation. The Borgia approach to problems had been straightforward: eliminate obstacles through force, deception, or poison. Lucrezia's approach in Ferrara was more sophisticated: build alliances through cultural engagement, maintain security through diplomatic relationships, and create stability through effective governance. This wasn't just a personal transformation, it was a demonstration of an alternative approach to Renaissance politics. While her contemporaries were fighting expensive wars and engaging in destructive feuds, Lucrezia was building the kind of cultural and diplomatic capital that created lasting value. Ferrara, under her influence, became more prosperous, more secure, and more internationally respected than it had been under purely military leadership. The economic implications of her approach were significant. Cultural patronage attracted wealthy visitors, diplomatic relationships facilitated profitable trade agreements, and effective governance created the kind of stability that encouraged long-term investment. By the time of her death, Ferrara was punching well above its weight in European politics. not because of military power, but because of cultural prestige and diplomatic sophistication. Her educational legacy was equally important. The scholars, artists and writers who benefited from her patronage carried her influence far beyond Ferrara's borders. They created works that reflected her aesthetic and intellectual values. They maintained correspondence networks that preserved her diplomatic relationships, and they generally served as ambassadors for the kind of cultural renaissance she had fostered. But perhaps her most significant achievement was simply surviving and thriving despite her family background. The Borgia name should have been a permanent liability, marking her as dangerous and untrustworthy regardless of her personal behavior. Instead, she managed to transform it into a source of interesting complexity that enhanced rather than damaged her reputation. People were curious about her because of her family history, but they respected her because of her individual achievements. This transformation required an almost superhuman level of emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. She had to navigate the competing demands of family loyalty and political independence, personal relationships and diplomatic necessities, cultural interests and economic realities. She had to maintain her dignity while acknowledging past mistakes, demonstrate strength while showing appropriate humility, and exercise power while respecting the gender conventions of her era. The fact that she succeeded at this balancing act for nearly 2 decades suggests capabilities that went far beyond what her early training had prepared her for. She had to essentially teach herself how to be a different kind of person than she had been raised to be, while operating under constant scrutiny from people who were looking for evidence that she was reverting to Borgia type. Her correspondence reveals someone who was genuinely intellectually curious about the world beyond politics. She asked questions about artistic techniques, philosophical problems, and scientific developments that had no obvious political implications. This suggests that her cultural engagement wasn't just strategic, but reflected genuine interests that she had never had the opportunity to pursue during her youth. The contrast with her brother Cesare's trajectory is particularly striking. Both siblings had received similar educations and similar training in political strategy, but they responded very differently to the collapse of Borgia power. Cesare spent his final years trying to restore the family's military dominance and died in an obscure battle, essentially forgotten by the world he had once dominated. Lucrezia built a new identity based on different values, and died surrounded by people who genuinely mourned her loss. This suggests that personal choice and individual character mattered more than family conditioning or political circumstances. Both siblings had the intelligence and education necessary to succeed in Renaissance politics, but they made different decisions about how to use their capabilities. Cesare chose to double down on the Borgia approach of military conquest and political intimidation. Lucrezia chose to experiment with cultural leadership and diplomatic engagement. The long-term results speak for themselves. Cesare is remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited ambition, while Lucrezia is increasingly recognized as a successful political leader who happened to be female. His achievements died with him. Her achievements outlasted her by decades and influenced Renaissance culture in ways that are still being discovered by historians. In the end, Lucrezia Borgia's greatest accomplishment may have been proving that people are not prisoners of their circumstances or their family backgrounds. She demonstrated that intelligence, determination, and moral courage could overcome even the most difficult starting conditions. She showed that it was possible to learn from past mistakes without being defined by them, to honor family loyalty without being limited by family methods, and to exercise power in ways that created rather than destroyed value. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're trying to understand Renaissance history or navigate the complexities of modern life. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most misunderstood lives, it's worth reflecting on what Lucrezia Borgia's story tells us about power, transformation, and the possibility of redemption. She began as a child weaponized by her family's ambitions, and ended as a woman who had created her own legacy of cultural achievement and political success. The arc of her life reads like a Renaissance novel, except it actually happened, and the protagonist managed to survive with her dignity and humanity intact. The final irony of Lucrezia's story is that she outlived not just her dangerous family but also her own reputation. By the time of her death in 1519, she had become genuinely respected across Europe for her intelligence, cultural patronage, and effective governance. The scandals of her youth had been largely forgotten or reinterpreted as products of political propaganda rather than personal failing. She had successfully transformed herself from a symbol of corruption into a model of Renaissance leadership. But history has a way of preferring simple narratives to complex realities, and the myths about Lucrezia proved more durable than the facts about her achievements. For centuries after her death, she was remembered primarily as the legendary poisoner, the beautiful but dangerous daughter of Pope Alexander VI, the woman who had built one of the most sophisticated cultural courts in Renaissance Europe, was reduced to a character in sensational stories about papal corruption and family dysfunction. This distortion tells us as much about the limitations of historical memory as it does about Lucrezia herself. We're more comfortable with archetypal figures, the evil stepmother, the femme fatale, the innocent victim, than with real people who don't fit neatly into moral categories. Lucrezia's actual story is more interesting than any of the myths, but it's also more complicated and morally ambiguous than audiences typically want their historical figures to be. The persistence of these myths also reflects deeper assumptions about women and power that were prevalent in Lucrezia's time, and have persisted in various forms into the modern era. A woman who exercises political influence is assumed to be using manipulation or sexual favors rather than intelligence and administrative skill. A woman who survives in a dangerous political environment is suspected of being more ruthless than male contemporaries who employ similar survival strategies. Modern historical scholarship has largely rehabilitated Lucrezia's reputation, but the process has taken centuries and required access to documents that weren't available to earlier historians. The letters preserved in the d'Este archives, the diplomatic correspondence in various European courts, and the artistic works commissioned during her time in Ferrara all provide evidence of a woman whose achievements were substantial and whose character was more complex than either her defenders or her critics suggested. What emerges from this more complete historical record is a figure who embodies some of the most important themes of Renaissance culture: the possibility of individual transformation, the power of education and cultural engagement, and the complex relationship between political necessity and moral choice. Lucrezia's life demonstrates that even people shaped by the most difficult circumstances can choose to use their capabilities for constructive rather than destructive purposes. Her approach to leadership, combining cultural patronage with diplomatic engagement, supporting intellectual achievement while maintaining political security and building lasting institutions rather than just accumulating personal power, offers insights that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about effective governance and the responsible use of influence. Perhaps most importantly, her story challenges us to think more carefully about how we evaluate historical figures, particularly women who exercised power in male-dominated societies. Lucrezia operated within the constraints and opportunities available to her, made choices that reflected both personal values and political necessities, and achieved results that created lasting value for the people and institutions she served. The contrast between her early life as a Borgia political asset and her later years as an independent leader illustrates the possibilities and limitations of personal agency in historical circumstances. She couldn't choose her family or her early experiences, but she could choose how to respond to the opportunities that became available to her as an adult. The fact that she chose construction over destruction, cultural engagement over political revenge, and diplomatic cooperation over military confrontation suggests character strengths that transcended her upbringing. Her legacy in Ferrara outlasted her personal involvement by decades. The cultural institutions she supported, the diplomatic relationships she built, and the administrative reforms she implemented continued to benefit the duchy long after her death. This kind of institutional legacy is perhaps the best measure of effective leadership, creating value that doesn't depend on the continued presence of the leader who initiated it. The artists and writers who benefited from her patronage carried her influence throughout Renaissance Europe and beyond. Their works reflected the aesthetic and intellectual values she promoted, and their careers demonstrated the practical benefits of supporting genuine cultural achievement rather than just politically useful projects. In this sense, Lucrezia's impact on Renaissance culture was both broader and more lasting than her political influence. As we conclude this examination of her life, it's important to acknowledge both her achievements and her limitations. She was not a saint or a perfect leader, but she was a genuinely remarkable person who managed to transcend exceptionally difficult circumstances and create something valuable from the opportunities available to her. She proved that intelligence, determination, and moral courage could overcome family background, gender constraints, and political obstacles. Her story also reminds us that historical truth is often more complex and interesting than popular legend. The real Lucrezia Borgia was neither the monster of myth nor the innocent victim of historical revision, but something more compelling, a human being who grew and changed over time, learned from her experiences, and ultimately chose to use her capabilities for purposes that created rather than destroyed value. In our current era of political polarization and cultural division, Lucrezia's approach to leadership offers some instructive examples. She demonstrated that it's possible to maintain principles while adapting to changing circumstances, to build bridges across political and cultural differences, and to create lasting positive change through patient engagement rather than dramatic confrontation. The woman who died peacefully in Ferrara in 1519 had travelled an extraordinary distance from the 13-year-old political pawn who had been married off to advance her father's ambitions. She had created her own identity, built her own legacy, and proved that even the most notorious family backgrounds don't have to determine individual destiny. That journey from weaponized daughter to respected leader remains one of the most remarkable personal transformations in European history. And perhaps that's the most important lesson Lucrezia Borgia offers us, that change is possible, that people are more than their worst circumstances, and that intelligence combined with moral courage can create value that outlasts the political systems that originally shaped it. So there you have it, the true story of history's most misunderstood woman, who proved that even Borgias could choose redemption over revenge. If you enjoyed watching someone rewrite their entire life story through sheer force of will, you know exactly what button to hit.